Hi. For reasons I don't think I need to get into right now, this is now being February of 2025, there's been a lot of talk, particularly in Europe, about the desirability of having a collective European military. Is this a good idea? Is it even possible? I want to try and answer those questions, or at least address them in this video. My name, by the way, is Michael Shurkin, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Pax Americana, a conversation about world affairs, global conflict, military strategy, and anything else that happens to be on my mind. Before I forget, if you like this video, please hit the like button and also subscribe if you have not already subscribed. It really helps my channel, and I thank you for doing that. Okay, so the basic arguments, though, in favor of having a European military are as follows. So, one, European nations already spend a lot of money on defense, and yet the whole ends up being considerably less than the sum of the parts. Now, if you want proof, look at the fact that Europe doesn't seem to be able to insert itself into the debates going on now, or the negotiations going on now between Trump and Putin about Ukraine. Europe should have a seat at the table. Europe should even have a veto. But they don't. They're not even there. And I think the reality is because in order to have the kind of diplomatic or political clout to be able to assume that role, regrettably, in this world, this still requires having hard power, which Europe still lacks. And I think that's a real problem. Now, more tangibly, what this means is that for all the money that the Europeans spend, they have really very little in terms of military capabilities to show for all the money. So according to my research, for example, in 2024, European NATO members, so I'm excluding Turkey, spent a total of $380 billion. It's a lot of money. But with that, like, what do you get? So of all of them, probably France is the only country that could actually field a full army division. The British, maybe. I mean, it'd be a very heavy lift, and it's not clear that they could sustain it for any length of time. The Germans, even more so. I think the Italians probably have the numbers, but I suspect the Italians are probably in the same boat as the Germans in terms of readiness. Like, they've got the stuff, but the stuff might not be in operable condition, and that kind of thing. And then everybody else, like behind the Italians, is really nobody. Like, everybody can cough up maybe a brigade, but this just doesn't cut it, because we're talking about, like, at most 3 divisions and some brigades. It's like there really isn't a lot. It's really very small. I keep thinking, like, in the Cold War, I think that the Germans had 12 divisions. I mean, that's a really big deal. It's all gone. Nobody has anything like that. The second argument is that currently there's a lot of redundancy because each military has its own structures and everything, and they also most of them try to have as much of the spectrum of capabilities as they can possibly afford. And this means that everyone is trying to curate what amounts to like a little bonsai tree. Bonsai in the sense that it's like it's got all the features of a full military, but it's this tiny little thing that really just doesn't do a lot. It doesn't afford, for instance, a lot of shade. In this case, shade being security, like real meaningful security. Now, the third problem is that currently there's a problem with defense industry and industrial policy. All of these countries tend to try to nurture their own defense industries, which means that they insist on being able to build their own things and then buy stuff that they build themselves. By and large. Now, the problem is that if you do that, this means that they're really only buying small numbers of stuff from their industries, which means that the industries are really geared only to make those small numbers of things. So they just don't have the capacity for anything more. This also means that the unit price for all these things tend to be relatively high. And this is a real problem. So the theory is that if you have any kind of collectivized defense spending and you have a united European force, you're going to fix a lot of these things. You're going to get far more bang for your buck. The Europeans will get far more bang for their buck. There'll be less redundancy, and they will have a larger and much more complete force. And moreover, if they could agree to reduce the number of industries that they have and even shutter some and make larger orders from fewer firms, you end up with lower unit costs and a greater industrial capacity. I'm thinking about it this way. Like, currently, let's imagine, like, everybody builds their own infantry fighting vehicle, and they're only buying like a few hundred each of these infantry fighting vehicles, which means that those industries are basically geared in order to supply those few hundred infantry fighting vehicles. Now, theoretically, with some sort of collectivized defense spending, what they're doing is they're just buying more of everything. So instead of buying a few hundred infantry fighting vehicles from each manufacturer, you're ordering 2,000. And that firm would thus have the capacity to make orders, to fill these orders at a much larger scale than they would have otherwise. So all of this makes sense. It's a compelling argument, and I think it could be done. However, there are some real problems that I think need to be taken into consideration. So, for example, Agreeing to shutter industries, national defense industries, and to collectivize defense procurement would require immense political will. Each country also, of course, would seek complex arrangements so that they would protect as many jobs as possible. This isn't possible to do, but I think politically it's really very difficult. Two, different countries have different strategic cultures and different ideas about when to use armed forces, for what purpose, and where, and how, right? So France and Germany, I think in this regard, represent different extremes. So France is actually remarkably willing to use force. They're remarkably willing to conduct expeditionary operations outside of Europe. Uh, the Germans, in contrast, are profoundly reluctant to use force and are very squeamish with respect to, well, anything. And they're also reluctant to engage in expeditionary operations. Now, they do, right? So Germans were in Afghanistan. Germans were in Mali, at least with MINUSMA. But it's a very different kind of thing. So imagine if you collectivize your military and then the French decide that it's in their national interest to go to war in, I don't know, Libya or Africa. They really can't anymore. And because, maybe the Germans don't want to or nobody else wants to. There needs to be a consensus about all of these things, about when to go to war and how do you go to war and where do you go to war, etc. Having such a political consensus is possible to construct, but it would be really very difficult to do. Now, of course, having different visions about when, where, and how to use force often translates into different doctrines and different tactics and different understandings of military requirements. So as a result, different militaries organize themselves differently. They buy different things according to what they think they need a military for and what they think that they need for the military to do the thing that they want their militaries to be able to do. Now, this is why, for example, most French armored vehicles have wheels, because the French are thinking in terms of expeditionary operations. The French also are thinking in terms of logistical requirements in austere environments like Mali, and they have limited logistical means. So they need a force that's relatively easy to transport and move around and easy to maintain and sustain and that kind of thing. Countries that are really thinking just about continental warfare, like the Germans, they favor tracks, because if you're fighting, duking it out in the European theater, exclusively, tracks are absolutely the way to go. Also, countries like Britain, France, and Italy are thinking in terms of force projection outside of Europe. They think they need this ability. So they have aircraft carriers. They have amphibious capabilities. The Germans, who don't have these aspirations or ambitions, don't have any of these things. Why would they? Similarly, the British and the French have nuclear-powered submarines. The whole point of a nuclear-powered submarine really is that you can send them very far away, which is very useful if you have global ambitions and think of yourself as being a global power. For everybody else, diesel submarines are absolutely fine. That's really all you need. So that's why the Germans don't have them, and really nobody else other than the British and the French have nuclear-powered submarines, at least in Europe. So again, you would have to work out a consensus about what do you need a military for, what kind of requirements do you need, and what kind of doctrines you're going to do. Again, none of this is impossible, but it's all really very difficult. And just to say a little bit more about doctrine, with respect to how to fight, each military does things differently. And I mean, the good news is that thanks to NATO, they at least have common references with respect to doctrine, tactics, etc. I think of it as imagine that all these militaries have these NATO binders, right? It's like if you want to do something the NATO way, here's your binder that you can take off the shelf and you can look up and say, okay, well, the NATO way to maneuver is this. The NATO way to do a call for fires is this. And that's useful in that, the Italian has the binder, the Greek has the binder, the German has the binder. They all have the same binders, which means you could all use these common references. However, for no military, at least as far as I know, is the NATO way the native way. It's not their default way. They still do their thing the way they do it. It's just that they have the NATO stuff that they can pull off the shelf. For them to have a collective military, one has to have a unified doctrine, unified tactics, unified everything, so that everybody does things the same way. So because there's really going to have to be a European way. Now, who decides that? And what doctrines? And how do you develop that? It's all doable, but it's difficult. 5, I think France is a real problem, which is kind of ironic given that I think Macron is probably on the leading edge with calling for things like a European defense. But the thing is that France is, Britain, Western Europe's largest and most capable military. It treasures its strategic autonomy. A strategic autonomy in the French sense is the idea that the French want to be able to make for themselves decisions about war, when to fight, where to fight. It wants to be able to to pursue its own interests as it sees them and not have other people dictate to it when to fight, what to fight, or what interests are important or not important, right? What interests are worth defending. So for France to join a collective effort, France would have to give up its strategic autonomy. And it would also have to accept the idea that it would basically no longer have the ability to interpret its interests as it sees fit. It's got to adhere to a collective understanding of European interests and European requirements and really defer to Europe. I mean, it's almost a question of sovereignty. Everybody would have to give up sovereignty in this regard. I just think it'd be more difficult for France to do it than the little countries like the Netherlands or other countries. So again, it's all doable, but probably much more difficult than people would think. There are also, I believe, significant legal and constitutional issues having to do with who decides when to go to war, who's in charge, etc. I mean, this is all written into different constitutions. So, for example, to use the French again as an extreme example, the French president in the current French constitution has incredible freedom with respect to the use of force. He can kind of go to war whenever he wants to go to war, and he really doesn't have to defer to the National Assembly. The British Prime Minister has less freedom, but still a lot of freedom. But then when we compare to, then the other extreme is Germany. Anything having to do with the German military has to be debated by the German parliament. They're going to wring their hands about everything and debate and discuss and talk and talk and talk. And it's a real problem. So this is why, for instance, for a project I did at the RAND Corporation, I looked at interoperability, and I spent a lot of time talking to French officers who were involved with the Franco-German brigade. There's a brigade that is like half French and half German. And they've been able to work out a lot of the interoperability issues. Like, they know how to work together, they know how to talk to each other, they know how to do things together. And it's really a remarkable achievement because it's taken a lot of work. However, when you talk to the French about this, they say, yeah, it works, but it's useless. Why? Because France can decide sort of at the turn, on a dime, like, we're going to go to war. The Germans could come to that same decision, but it's going to take them a long time because it has to be debated in Parliament, and it's a really convoluted process, which means that from a French point of view, it's really a useless thing, and which is why the French tend to focus more on what they call the CJEF, the Combined Joint Expeditionary Force, that they do with the British, because they understand that the British are kind of on the same page with respect to, hey, there's an emergency, we got to react now, and we got to go. Right. So they see the British as being better partners with respect to actual war fighting than the Germans, because the Germans are going to have to talk about it and talk and talk and talk. And it's an issue. But all of these countries, so you've got France on one extreme, Germany on the other, and everybody else in Europe, I think, is somewhere in the middle. And in order for them to agree to have a collective military, they're ultimately going to have to change their constitutions and just change a lot of profound things. All of this is doable, but it's difficult. I think of the example of Little Belgium in 1918. The Belgian army, they fought on through World War I, and it was really remarkable because most of Belgium was occupied, but they still retained an army, and they fought, and they were great. But when the Allies in the spring of 1918 decided that it was a good idea, a necessary thing, to put everybody under the command of Marshal Ferdinand Foch and make him the supreme Allied commander, the Belgians had to stay outside this whole command structure. The Belgians had a constitutional problem. You see, the commander of the Belgian army was none other than King Albert I. And he was the real commander. It's not like a ceremonial thing, the way like King Charles today is actually officially the commander of the British military. No, King Albert really was the commander, and from what I understand, he was actually quite good at it. But the problem is that constitutionally, the King of Belgium cannot be subordinate to a French commander. It just doesn't work. So Belgium had to stay out of the command structure. Now, fortunately for the Belgians and the French and for everybody else, the King Albert had a very good personal and good working relationship with Foch, so they got along very well. And so they were able to work out different issues, and everything was fine. And also, fortunately, Belgium's contribution to World War I, just given the small size of its military, it didn't really matter that much, even if there were serious problems in terms of coordinating with the Belgian army. It wasn't that big of a problem. What really mattered was that the bigger allies, the British, the Americans, the French, and the Italians were all on board with this, because those are the countries that mattered. So the bottom line for me is that while Europe could have a unified military, it's doable, and it would solve a lot of the problems that they face today. Such a project would actually be really very difficult and would take a long time to put into place. Also, if you go back to the spring 1918 situation when everybody agreed to put themselves under Foch's command, that was an emergency. It was an emergency situation because that was the big German spring offensive, and they were scared because the Germans almost defeated them. And so in an emergency, people had the will and had the ability to do quickly very difficult things. So whatever they needed to work out in terms of the legalities and the MOUs and all that sort of stuff in order to put them all under Foch's command, they got it done. Whatever they needed to do, they got it done, and it was fine. Today there really isn't an emergency, so it's going to that kind of urgency is there. So the project of having European military, even if it were desirable, even if it were established as a long-term goal, would take a really, really long time. So what do you do? I hate to say it. Well, first of all, I hate to say it because everybody says it, but the Europeans have to spend more money, a lot more money. They need bigger militaries, they need to buy more stuff, and they need to spend the kind of money that would actually translate into expanded industrial capacity, not just more stuff. So they would also have to take seriously the idea of more group buys, which does mean having to kill off perhaps some industry. So they'd have to make decisions, like they need to sort of say, all right, well, let's everybody buy, you want a fighter jet, buy a Rafale, buy from Dassault, instead of trying to buy these other things or make their own. Or, we're going to buy our tanks from Krauss Maffei Wegmann. Those are the people who make the Leopard 2s. Or their attack helicopters to buy from, I don't know, Leonardo. Or also it would be useful if they just sort of settled on things, like, for instance, with infantry fighting vehicles or like tanks or however you want to define it. Everybody agrees that the Swedish CV90 is great. So maybe everybody should just buy CV90s instead of kind of screwing around with their own thing, which is really more or less what they're doing. So if they all bought like a standard off-the-shelf CV90, then they would be placing much larger orders, and the industry would have the money to invest in order to expand its industrial capacity. And I think it would be, from an economic point of view, it would be extremely advantageous. But this issue about sort of screwing around on alternatives, it makes me think about the Boxer program. So the British had this whole armored vehicle modernization program. The name just escapes me, but I did a whole video in which I talked about this. And at some point they abandoned it after wasting a lot of money and time. But they just, they needed an infantry fighting vehicle. So at some point they looked at the French VBCI, which had just come online and is really very good. And they borrowed a few of them from the French and they sort of put it through its paces. And they decided, this is great, but it doesn't quite exactly fit our specific requirements because we have different requirements than the French. Right. So, again, every military has its own understanding of what do they need a vehicle to be able to do. So they kind of fussed around a little bit more, and then they ended up basically with a Boxer, although I think they modified a little bit. But either way, they're ending up with the Boxer. Now, Boxer's great, and maybe the Boxer really is a better fit for the British Army than the VBCI. Like, I don't want to get into that whole debate. That's not my point. The point is, like, imagine if the British, instead of sort of fussing around, they just said, you know what, screw it. We're just going to buy a whole bunch of VBCI, and we're going to buy them off the shelf. We're going to buy the same ones that the French are buying for themselves because, it is perfectly adequate. This is adequate. It's not an exact fit over requirements, but it's fine. We're just going to buy the same because if you buy the same thing that the French are buying, this means, again, the industry responds in terms of capacity, and then also the unit cost is lower, et cetera, et cetera. It's like a win. It's a win for the French. It's a win for the British. It's also a win for the Belgians, who I believe are also buying VBCI. Like, everybody's kind of better off just by virtue of sort of getting over this need to have things that are tailored for their own specific requirements. It's difficult to do, but I think it's still plausible. Now, like, as proof of the European defense industry's inability to meet capacity, to have capacity, just look at the fact that the Poles are buying a lot of stuff from the Koreans, right? And, I'd like to think that if the Poles maybe would have liked to have bought German stuff or French stuff or Italian stuff, but none of those industries could actually supply them with the things in the numbers that they wanted to buy them. But the Koreans could. Plus the Koreans were happy to transfer the tech so that the Poles are going to be making a lot of the Korean stuff on their own. But also sort of on the subject of industrial capacity, from my understanding is that the production lines could be tweaked so that they can produce more stuff at a higher rate. But it's really incremental. What you need is a lot of money to really, really expand the industrial capacity. So let's talk about Dassault, for example. Dassault, which builds the Rafale. Dassault is kind of maxed out. So if you wanted to buy 20, 30 Rafale from Dassault would have to tell you to get in line because they just can't produce that many that quickly. They're already busy. My theory is that if instead of ordering 20 or 30 Rafale from Dassault, you ordered 300 Rafale or 200, I don't know the exact number, I don't know where the threshold is, and gave them billions of euros, Dassault would then be able to make the kind of investment that's required to go well beyond simply incrementally increasing its production capacity, and double it or triple it. What's stopping them from doing it now is just the incredible expense in doing it. I mean, for instance, is a question of human resources. Building a modern fighter jet requires people with a lot of specific industrial skills, and those people are very scarce. So in order to have the people, you have to hire them, you have to train them, et cetera, et cetera. This is an expensive thing. But it can be done, but I think it's really only possible if you're willing to put a lot of money on the table and place much larger orders. I think this is something that Europeans could probably work out and do even without having to collectivize all of their defense spending and their defense procurement. If you go back to World War I think this makes a really good model for something short of collectivized military, but you still have a lot of coordination and communication and work regarding division of labor, who does what where, and with what stuff, and who builds what, who supplies what, that kind of thing. And the British and the French worked out this very productive relationship, and I think also the Italians were involved, and others. And when the United States joined the war, they were able to include the Americans in these conversations to figure out what can American industry supply, what do the Americans need to buy from the French, what do the Americans need to buy the British. And they did this, they worked it out. So as a result, when the Americans went to war, I believe their helmets, they're British, at least the British design. I don't know who actually made those. But they had American rifles, but French artillery and French aircraft. Most of the tanks the Americans used were French, but they also had some British tanks. Most of the machine guns the Americans used were French, but some of them were British and some of them were homegrown Brownings. Some American troops were trained by the British. Most were trained by the French. The British and the French and the Americans had to work out very complex arrangements with regard to logistics, because you've got to find ships that you can send to America, and then you got to pick up the American troops and transport them to French ports. And then once in the French ports, you've got to unload the ships, and then you've got to distribute the American stuff throughout France. All of that's hyper complicated, but they worked it out, and they worked it out remarkably quickly. And I think that's the kind of mindset that they need to have. And what makes that all possible is will combined with a sense of urgency. This need, like, they got to do it fast. They can't just dawdle and take their time. They need to get the Americans to France as soon as possible. They need to get the Americans trained as soon as possible. They need to get the Americans equipped as soon as possible. So let's work it out and let's get it done. All of this could be done, but only with will. And even though this is all difficult, it's still an easier lift than the larger dream of having a collective European military with collective spending, collective procurement, etc. So a united European military, sure, but you got to make that a long-term project, because it will be a long-term project. It's like at least a generational project. But for now, for the near and medium term, what you need to do is think about, well, you just got to spend a lot more. And you need to think like you're back in 1918. You got to make the arrangements in order to make it work, which means having very hard-nosed conversations about division of labor, about who builds what, who buys what from whom, who does what training, et cetera, et cetera. In the best case scenario, all this is really very difficult. But I still think it's much more feasible and could be done more quickly and realistically than the long-term project of having a collective European military. Thank you very much. If you like this video, as I said before, please hit the like button and also subscribe if you haven't subscribed already. If you look at the description, you'll also find I put in links to my LinkedIn, my Blue Sky, my Twitter accounts, and also my own website, michaelshuriken.com, and also my Substack, Pax Americana, same name, and I write for that weekly. Stay tuned for more. There's plenty more in the pipeline, and I look forward to seeing you in my next video. Thank you very much.